Welcome, everyone, and special shout out to my team Fuqua colleagues, folks who I've had in class before. It's been too long. We all live in a Zoom world now. I'm Ronnie Chatterji, professor of strategy here at the Fuqua School of Business. Today's talk is part of a special series Fuqua's launched on LinkedIn to share business insights around the issues of fairness, justice, and race. If you missed yesterday's session with Rick Larrick, don't worry, you can find all the videos right here on Fuqua's page. I've gotten a lot of emails and suggestions from former students over the last 2.5 weeks in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. The issues around race, systemic racism in particular, policing in corporate America have really loomed large across the country. And you've seen so many CEOs speaking out about race, some for the very first time. So I just want to take a few minutes to tell you some of the observations I have about what's going on today when it comes to corporate America, CEOs speaking out. And then I thought I'd take some of your questions and comments, given there's got to be a lot of people in the audience who have taken my course. The course we teach here at Fuqua is a business and politics class called Advanced Corporate Strategy. A lot of you remember the first case in that class, which is around CEO Activism. And so many of you have emailed me to say, isn't this a great case study that you can update your class with for next year? And I'm totally working on that right now. It all started with a series of articles, the Harvard Business Review cover story on the new CEO activists, which we'll put on the chat and you can take a look if you haven't already. The CEO activism, as we define it, my co-author Mike Toffel and I, is corporate executives speaking out about social and political issues that are often not directly related to their business. And what you're seeing over the last 2.5 weeks with corporate leaders speaking out about race is a great example of CEO activism in the making. But there are so many things that corporate executives haven't yet done. And I want to talk a little bit about that because CEO activism in the examples that Mike and I provide in our work isn't just about speaking out or tweeting. It's also about trying to influence public policy. And so one big difference I see between the CEOs speaking out today and some of our prior efforts, at least to date, is you don't always see CEOs articulating specific pieces of legislation, for example, that they can get behind or support. And I think there's going to be a lot of increased pressure for them to do that. Why do I think this? When you think about what's going on now, CEOs have released several statements. They've been on CNBC and Twitter and talked about their feelings about race. What's different now than, let's say, 2016, when I wrote about this for Fortune, is that the politics has really changed considerably. You see attitudes towards Black Lives Matter, for example, in a very different place than it was in 2016. You see CEOs using that term and phrase much more than they would have before. So that's a big change in terms of public opinion. Second is these corporate executives are also talking about systemic racism in a different way. Before, these issues were talked about in terms of race relations, isolated incidents, and now CEOs are really talking about systems, which is another big change in terms of how they're approaching the debate. But here's what I think is really interesting. The same advocates who are calling on corporations to do more on this issue are going to be looking at how companies interact with the political system. Companies have a lot of power when it comes to what we call non-market strategy, and how they shape the rules of the game. Think about how companies prioritize things like intellectual property law, tax reform, education funding when they approach legislators at the federal, state, and local level. They support campaigns and they lobby politicians they support to endorse particular initiatives that will help those companies and create a better business environment. So the question that a lot of advocates, including employees, are going to be asking is, now that we've said all these things about race and systemic racism in particular, what are we going to do as companies to help unwind the system and change the rules of the game to make a more level playing field? And that could be prioritizing it in companies' non-market strategies as well. But is this likely to happen? Well, the real challenge here is that companies have lots of legislative priorities. And it's unclear to me whether they're going to make race issues and systemic racism in particular their top priorities in terms of their political strategies. What you're seeing instead is a lot of focus on investing in African-American owned businesses. You're seeing increases in transparency among diversity and executive leadership. The New York Times editorial board called for that yesterday in an op-ed, and you can take a look at that. Changes in hiring practices and broader awareness inside the company about employee attitudes. So you're seeing all these things that companies are proposing. I think one way to think about CEO activism is CEOs can have an impact in different ways. One way is on her own organization. A CEO can change something she's doing in the organization, change something about her management team, change something about the way she operates her company to deal with a specific issue, whether it's climate change or race. On the other hand, CEOs can also speak out about pending legislation. That's what happened during HB2 here in North Carolina, or the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana with Tim Cook. Or CEOs can actually go and lobby politicians and policymakers to make certain changes. And you saw that in the aftermath of the Park Lane shootings with Dick's CEO, Ed Stack, who really laid out a very sort of detailed plan to deal with gun control in America. I think there's a few interesting things to watch. How accountable will CEOs and companies be held to in terms of the initiatives they're announcing now? How long will this movement last, and how will the pressure increase as our attention turns to other issues in the upcoming months? We also are in the midst of a presidential election, which is going to have a huge impact on the issues that are being discussed. The last thing I'll say, and then I'd love to take some questions or comments. How do you think, one thing to look at is these leadership challenges. I've been getting so many emails and communications from not just CEOs, but leaders of all kinds of organizations, nonprofits and churches and business schools, all who are grappling with how to deal with these issues. And for those of you who took my class, you know that a lot of the class was not providing a right answer in terms of how to talk about these issues, but to give you a framework so you can make those decisions yourself. And so I'd love to hear from people who are in LinkedIn right now, who are listening to this, about how they're dealing with these leadership challenges. Have you released a statement to your organization? Have you asked your employers to do the same? How have you thought about crafting your words and language? Have you thought about adding action to what you're saying, or is it just more expressing an opinion? These are all things we talked about in the advanced corporate strategy class, and all things I hope to hear from you in the chat. Some of the CEOs and corporate leaders that really stood out to me during this period. You think about Ken Frazier at Merck, really talking about his own experience as an African-American executive and relating that to the killing of George Floyd and racism in the United States and around the world. You see CFO Mark Mason of Citi quoting George Floyd in his statement. "I can't breathe" is what his statement said. And that was incredibly powerful. Another prominent African-American executive. You've also seen the flip side with the CEOs of CrossFit and CPI getting in hot water for comments they made about race, the protests, and Black Lives Matter. So you've seen different examples of CEOs, some who have released statements that have drawn a lot of positive attention, and others much more negative attention. And certainly, this is a really important time for corporate executives to get together with their communication teams to figure out how they're going to talk about these issues. I'd love to open it up to your questions and comments that you may have. I know there's folks in the chat who have taken my class before. So why don't we open it up now, and I can think about taking some of these questions, and we can go from there. And thanks everyone for being here. So let's start with the risks and rewards of CEO activism. We're getting a question about that on the chat. So the risks and rewards of CEO activism are something that we've talked about in our new CEO Activism article that was posted there. What's really interesting here is we live in a very polarized world. When you think about what's going on around discussions about race in this country, is that you see that public opinion, while shifting, there's considerable pockets of disagreement. And so the cost of speaking out when it comes to CEO activism is always that you're going to alienate customers that disagree with you. The benefits are, of course, is that you stand by with your employees, let's say your customers who do agree with you, and others, and you galvanize them by taking a position on an issue. The logic used to be, let's just stay away from political issues. You're always going to irritate 50% of your consumer base. And in a polarized world, that might seem like a really good advice to follow now. But what you are seeing is, because the two groups are often so polarized, staying in the middle has been very difficult. We wrote about this in an online piece for Harvard Business Review called "Divided We Lead." You're seeing corporate executives, nonprofit leaders, university presidents, faith-based leaders leading in a world that's very divided. Look at the conversation about masks in the United States and how we're thinking about it in terms of public health versus political statements. Well, it's the same thing with so many of these political issues. So being in the middle used to be a really attractive place for a lot of corporate executives. But right now, it's often untenable. Sometimes silence is equated with agreeing. And because Twitter is a microphone that's always on, your silence is especially conspicuous. And so what I'm seeing is, for many CEOs, silence isn't really an option. So the benefits of speaking out are often galvanizing those who disagree with you. Our limited research on this has found, at least with Apple CEO Tim Cook, that his statements around LGBTQ issues after the RFRA legislation in Indiana galvanized consumers and did not necessarily turn off consumers who disagree with them to the same extent. You also have to remember, you might be looking at something that's 50-50 in terms of poll, but intensity of opinion really, really matters. I hate to bring up basketball, but if you think about Duke and UNC, you might have a 50-50 fan base, but there might be different levels of intensity on either side of that. And so you have to think hard about whether the 50-50 split is really that, or whether your most loyal consumers are the most passionate about an issue you might take. So that's how I think about the benefits and the cost. Another question coming up, which is fantastic, is how can we measure actual change? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because at the end of the day, as a person who is both a scholar and a teacher, but also getting involved myself in public service, I'm interested to know not just statements that CEOs are making, but what the long-term change is going to be and how we can measure it. Because we all know how this works. The news cycle is shorter and shorter. It probably lasts just a few hours for most stories. This conversation about race in America, though, is persisting to be on the front pages of the paper and all over our Twitter feeds. But what happens when we inevitably move on to another set of issues? What happens when these initiatives that have been announced are away from the headlines? Who's going to be keeping track to make sure that companies are actually delivering on some of these things? I think a lot about the push to get more diversity in our top corporate ranks. And going back to that New York Times editorial, since I started graduate school in 2001, 19 years ago, I've been thinking, how much has corporate diversity really changed in that period? And how much effort have we put into it? And who's keeping track of this year after year after year and understanding whether the interventions we're doing are actually working? And I worry that some of the comments that are being made right now, it'd be very difficult to track the success of these, particularly internal corporate initiatives. And so it really depends in terms of the measurement. How committed are stakeholders, the media, employees, customers, and others to measuring actual change and keeping the focus on this? Some companies are pledging money. I think PwC and Walmart actually create big projects related to race, centers and initiatives with their own employees. That'll provide a really interesting example for those companies to engage with outside experts and advocates to figure out what we're actually measuring. And I think there is really good faith on the side of corporates in many cases to actually be held accountable for these things and get rewarded for their performance and the good strides they've made. So there'll be some really interesting collaboration opportunities for business school professors and scholars who do this, advocates who are working on it, but the measurement is still to be determined. People are using the words, instead of greenwashing, they're calling it woke washing. The idea that people are making statements about race, but not necessarily following through. That's a key thing to watch going forward. Lots of companies are being called out for not having the actual action to align with their rhetoric. And you see a lot of CEOs who are trying to address this issue head on. It's something I'm watching as well. With state and federal policies, it's really interesting. So you just saw in the Congress at the national level this week, or I should say, this week, they released national legislation, the Justice and Policing Act 2020. President Trump is supposed to today, he may have already, but he's going to announce an executive order around policing. So now we have all these initiatives. New York State, Governor Cuomo signed a bill the other day on this issue. Cities like Minneapolis are trying to reach consensus on these issues. So there's a lot of actual policy reforms now being either proposed or passed that relate to the issue at hand here, which is about policing and race. And again, because companies are so active in the political environment, there is going to be increased pressure on them to have opinions on these issues as well. I think you're going to start to see that, whether it's engagement with their stakeholders on Twitter or op-eds in places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. We have a piece coming out in Harvard Business Review exactly on this point, asking, are companies going to get behind these pieces of legislation and initiatives? Of course, it's very difficult because now we're moving from the world of statements to taking a side on what could be a very partisan political issue that involves a lot of different stakeholders, and companies may be really reluctant to get involved. So I'm interested to see how many companies actually get involved on the specifics. That's what Tim Cook did when it came to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's what Stack from Dick's Sporting Goods did when it came to guns. It'll be interesting to see if CEOs do the same thing on this very difficult and contentious issue right now. I do think, though, there has been a huge change, at least the way they're talking about it. And that is something to consider and think about. It'll be interesting to see, though, what follows up in terms of the actions on federal, state policy. I also think, and another part of this question is, maybe companies just turn inward and focus on their own organizations. There's a really good argument, and this is something we would talk about in class. My class was never about the right answers of how to do this thing. It was always about the choices you have. And I think for CEOs, there's at least three choices. One is to really focus and work on their own organizations and try to create systemic change through what they do in their own companies. If you're a large employer, you can have a huge impact in terms of what you do in your company, and it has spillovers to your community. The other thing is you can speak out. We see the value of whether it's celebrities, CEOs, and other well-known people speaking out on different issues. That's another theory of change. And the last one is working behind the scenes with political leaders. We saw this in North Carolina around HB2. A lot of business leaders were working behind the scenes to try to come up with a compromise around that issue. And I think that's another way you can have change. So it really depends on the individual CEO, what her theory of change is, and probably the political environment and her own personal beliefs. But I think if you're training to be a leader, you're going to be asked to address these issues. I mean, I kind of had to make that pitch the first time I took the class or taught the class. Sometimes I feel like I took the class because I learn as much as you guys do, but I don't tell you that till the end. But the first time I taught the class, it was really a question of, does this belong in a business school setting? And I think, so many of the events over the last couple of years say that this is part of the core knowledge that you should get at Fuqua. So much so that we're actually developing courses around things like common purpose to help all of our students navigate these issues. So let's talk next. We have an issue. Great. So this is a great question. Joe Perfetti, who I know well. Thank you, Joe, for an awesome question. The trade-off between CEOs' opinions on social issues and a board that might want to wade into this. And Joe is a smart guy who understands corporate finance. And so I think I understand why he's asking that question. So I have actually seen a lot of cases where the CEOs and the boards have clashed over this because so many of these comments are being made in real time. So I would talk to communications teams who would say, we wake up on the West Coast and my CEO's on the East Coast and he's already tweeted out about some really controversial issue. So a lot of times while we might want to scope everything out with the board and come up with a very sophisticated set of checks and balances, CEOs are being put on the spot now, on CNBC right now, on Twitter right now, and they often haven't had time to really check things with the board, which creates a lot of friction. What I've seen is the very best CEOs are ones who bring boards in early on their general philosophy and how they will react in different situations. You can't necessarily do scenario analyses for everything that might come up, but knowing that your CEO has strong opinions, let's say on climate change, diversity, or other issues, then you're more in expectation that if they speak out, it's not going to surprise, for example, a board. So I think it's up to CEOs to bring their board members along. Mark Benioff at Salesforce is pretty famous for this in terms of getting his board on board, as you should say, Joe. And there's a lot of other examples we could probably pick from corporate America. Mark Benioff and Colin Powell, that's a high-profile example about sort of the risks of CEO activism, with Colin Powell warning Mark Benioff that when you climb up too far up the tree, people can take shots at you. He said it in a more colorful way, but we don't have to go into that. But as you think through it, right, that's an example of board member and CEO conflict. But Mark Benioff was able to bring his board along on some of these different issues. It's one of the reasons he likes having General Powell on the team. Jessica Steinberg, hi Jessica, in DC, where I feel like it's the center of so many things right now. So thank you. I know we have a lot of great alums in DC. This is a great question. How do CEOs regain the public's trust when they make missteps? We all have followed that story about Starbucks originally saying, hey, you can't wear your Black Lives Matters pins and other sort of signs of support, and then reversing their stance because of public backlash. I haven't looked at this too much in my research, Jessica, so I can only tell you sort of my opinions and what I've talked about. I think when I watch these apologies from CEOs, there is a sense of those who are really following a playbook. Often I hear the words, I apologize for anyone I may have offended. For me, that always sounds really hollow because, the reason you're apologizing is you clearly offended a lot of people. But there are other ways to do these apologies that probably cite real actions you're going to take to back things up, explaining why you made the mistake and what you've learned. These are things, again, Jessica, I don't know from my own research. They just seem like when I'm watching these CEOs talk about these things that I would be asking for. I might not be the modal consumer in these things, so we need more research on these. It sounds like a good lab experiment I could work on with Aaron Kay and Hamant, who will be speaking tomorrow on these topics. So it's something to think about on apologies. I do see a standard template for a lot of these, and it could be the communications professionals believe that those are the best ways to apologize. But I always feel like the boilerplate ones don't really hit the spot for me. I also feel like in instances where the CEO is apologizing, they wouldn't have apologized if they weren't called out on it. So you always wonder what's caused that change of heart. Is it that they don't really believe what they said, or they've been called out for it? And that's a really challenging case. But you are seeing the cost of that, with CrossFit CEOs stepping down, CPI CEO under fire as well. The difference between public and private companies also looms large there, Jessica. Different kinds of pressures for public company CEOs versus private company CEOs. Kofi, I love you. You're there. Kofi has an amazing, just boss picture in Fuqua in the hallway. I don't know if it's still there, but it's like an amazing picture of him walking and Jason knows I'm right. We're walking basically with sunglasses and a bunch of cool Fuquans. That's Kofi, I'm sure. So Kofi, I hope that's up there because I love that picture. Do I see companies and executives collaborating on responses as opposed to going alone? Great, I do. I'm seeing that with a bunch of companies. I think Walmart and PwC are interesting in this regard. I mentioned them before. It's not just CEOs saying something. They're committing, I think in Walmart's case, $100 million to create an institute, I think, to study these issues, which is kind of wonky for a company, but really exciting. And you can see a lot of scholars getting involved in this. PwC initiating Tim Ryan, who spoke at our graduation a few years back and was amazing, talking about transparency in the organization and really tracking these metrics. And so I do think, actually, Kofi, that the best combinations are a statement that is meaningful and personal, like the ones that Kenneth Frazier and others have given, Mark Mason, but then coupled with real organizational action. Otherwise, these statements are just going to get lost in the shuffle. And we're becoming more skeptical as consumers. We're saying, look, show me what you really feel, show me what you're really going to do. And as more transparency about these efforts comes out, we're going to be able to make decisions as consumers and employees, I think, more often. I mean, the employee angle is really, really key. Most CEOs I talk to, they attribute the motivation to speak out about these issues to their employees more than their customers. They really want the people who are on this LinkedIn live chat to be working for them because you have a lot of options, particularly when the economy was very strong, many, many choices. And so, Kofi, because they want employees like you, they're thinking about these issues and they know that you're going to ask them at the interviews. And when they're selling you, which is often happening, hey, what have you actually done on this? And so I think it's kind of an interesting thing to watch going forward. Again, though, when bargaining power of employees decreases and the economy gets worse, or when we've moved on to other issues, it might be harder for employees to be asking those questions. So keep an eye on that as we go forward. Tala, good to see you too. I think you took the class, so you may know the answers to these questions better than me. How do CEOs manage if their words are misinterpreted? That's really hard. I think there's where, and kind of going back to Jessica's question, I think a really contrite apology can make sense. I mean, for a lot of us, these are really new issues. And for a lot of us, we're not used to talking about them in public settings. When I think about it for myself, I'm probably speaking to hundreds of people right now on an issue that is sensitive and raw. And if I was to say the wrong thing or use a term that wasn't correct or not be sensitive to an issue, I'd feel really bad and I'd want to express that. But sometimes you don't know until people tell you. I talk a lot about a story that I had an experience early on when I was teaching. And a couple students came up to me after class and they mentioned that, when we were referring to the male protagonists in a case, we were always using their last name, Chatterji, let's say. We were referring to the female protagonists who happen to be younger in this situation, but it's all the same. We were referring to them by their first names, let's say Jessica, Tala. And that created some sort of inequity. Why were we doing that? It wasn't something I noticed when I was teaching and facilitating this discussion. And because they came up to me privately, number one, I'm eternally grateful for them because they didn't embarrass me in front of the class. But I tried to make a point to really incorporate that and think about that in terms of how I refer to protagonists even today. And I think those kind of conversations really led to a big shift in how I teach and how I think about these things. And I think they can be learning experiences. And I tell that story as a way to explain, how I learned from it. And I think if folks can do that, then maybe they'll have better luck in terms of expressing. I do think honest and transparent expressions of what you did wrong, especially on these issues where you might have misspoke and it wasn't a true feeling or something you were trying to put across in that way, could be helpful. That's the best I can tell on that one. Luis, good to see you. I do think that he's asking about the differences in impact that these statements have between C-suite individuals versus company-wide. Whenever I see the company-wide press release, I always imagine who's writing this thing and is it just coming from sort of a nameless monolith company? I actually think when a CEO speaks personally, it can be more powerful. I haven't done explicit research on this, but we often find that personalizing these kinds of statements in many other settings has a different impact than having it as a company. People don't, there's a lot of interesting research. I would encourage you to check out the work of someone named Tage Rai, R-A-I, T-A-G-E. He probably doesn't know I'm plugging him right now, but he does this great work on whether companies can be seen as people or individuals with feelings and vulnerability, which is really fascinating and beyond the scope of this session. But it reminds me that it's difficult for people to see companies that way as much as they would see an individual. So I really think the individual ones will probably have more impact, but I could be wrong on that. I also think, Luis, though, if the CEO doesn't have much credibility on this, let's suppose it's an issue that she hasn't handled well before, then maybe a company statement or another executive could be more effective. So it probably depends on a case-by-case basis. Elizabeth Liu has a great question. CEOs' public responses may cause big influence on their companies, positive or negative. It's true. I mean, there's been a lot of studies on stock market reactions, CEO statements, and things like this. It's really hard to measure, Elizabeth, in the short term. Often, like an entire sector is going down, like retail, and they'll attribute it to a statement from the CEO of Target and talk about their stock price. I haven't really seen those kinds of impacts on the stock market response in such a big way. I'm sure there are examples. I think it's actually the longer term effects of trying to build a culture, let's say, to attract a certain type of employee. With Andy Medlin asking about red and blue companies, I can kind of put this together. I mean, there's this challenge about trying to attract the right people to your workplace. And I mentioned that in answering Kofi's question. And so I think the long-term impact is trying to get the folks that you want to work at your company in-house and trying to harness that human capital and do well for your firm as a response, as opposed to a specific statement in the stock market response. To Andy's question, though, this red and blue company issue thing is really interesting. We've written a little bit about this. I mean, first of all, when you think about the blue side of this, right, the liberal point of view, that's been the one that's been expressed by a lot of these CEO activism. And people have changed their minds, for example, on race issues. So you're seeing movement on that. What about the red companies? What about folks who have a conservative point of view? And I've talked about this in a lot of different settings. If you're a conservative employee, and I've had a good number of conservative students who we talked to this, mostly off the record, because it's challenging to kind of speak about these things in a large group. And I think we should recognize that. Well, conservative students, let's say, who might have a different point of view on climate change or whatever the issue might be, do they feel comfortable working for a company where their CEO has espoused something that's so different from their beliefs? Now put the shoe on the other foot. A really liberal student joining a company where the CEO is given a very conservative statement on an issue. How do we navigate these things? And if corporate America is tilting one direction or the other on the public statements, what does that mean for students who have different points of view? And so, Andy, I think it'd be a real shame if we had red and blue companies, because companies would get sucked into the polarization that's really dividing us as a country. I do think it would also change the way they recruit human capital and employees, and that's challenging as well. But you could see, as companies are sort of lining up on different issues, more of a trend to this in this direction. Right now, you do see on racial issues, systemic racism, there's really a lot of companies speaking out about it. Maybe some companies on different ends of the spectrum, but I haven't really seen, correct me if I'm wrong on the chat, a company saying, no, this isn't a problem, right? And so, but that's the problem that we have in these discussions, though. That might not be seen as a safe thing to be saying right now. And so we have a lot of ideological diversity at Fuqua in our classes. One of the things I really enjoy, we do a survey at the beginning of every class about people's beliefs. And so it's another element of diversity to think about in expressing opinions, and something I think about for my students. It's something that I hope I keep having those conversations and we can keep moving forward. It's one of the best things about the course. Couple minutes left. I'll take a couple questions and then I will wrap up right at 1. The great thing about these LinkedIn Live and Zoom sessions, everyone's jumping to the next one. So I'm sure 95% of people on this call right now have a Zoom call at 1 p.m. And I bet 50% of you are still in your pajamas. So this is totally good. I live this life. Daniel Ryan from Tampa. Really interesting question about how influential CEOs are in their political leadership in DC. I mean, look, I think, Daniel, CEOs, what they say on Twitter, it may or may not have a huge impact on politicians. But I can tell you that CEOs and companies are big donors to a lot of our politicians, and they're lobbying a lot of our politicians. So imagine if these kind of issues they're talking about became first priority issues. That could really change the game. One of the company's greatest powers in their toolkit is the ability to shape the rules of the game. And so I think they could have power too. Corey Best, let me just take Corey, and then of course Beth Henderson, who I love, Beth Henderson Davis, who took my class and is an amazing person who actually did a lot at Fuqua to raise these issues even before this current incident. For Beth, how do I feel the organizations can learn from the correct ways to step up when it comes to these issues without? That it's a longer discussion to have it, but you're right. We often place the burden on minority employees, employees of color, and specifically in this case, Black African-American employees to carry the torch. And they're already engaged in a lot of these efforts around the firm. And there's some fatigue. I mean, people are trying to navigate their own careers and move up to the next step of the ladder and balance work and life. Beth and I are both parents of young kids, so we know that. And putting that all on your Black employees to carry the torch for this isn't sustainable, and it's asking too much. And so while we want to invite people into the conversation, we all need to own it. And it's the same thing when it comes to gender issues in the organization. If it's always going to be on women to talk about these issues, and men aren't a part of it, we'll never make progress. And the burden will always be on the employees who are trying to accomplish the same things, which is pursue their career in advance and have a good work-life balance, men and women. So Beth, good question on that. Corey, another time we'll get to this issue about sort of the risks in war for Black CEOs. It is tricky, I will say, because of the lack of equity, as you mentioned in your question. Ken Frazier and Mark Mason, I think, did it well. But reminiscent of Beth's question, they're almost always on the spotlight because they're some of the few senior level Black executives out there. So they may feel that fatigue as well, although they embrace leadership in this instance. So just to make sure we end on time and get everyone out, I want to remind you all, we'll be doing the same thing tomorrow with Haman Kakar. Haman's one of our new faculty. He teaches management organizations, a great guy. I'll be on. He'll be talking tomorrow about the role that employee voice plays in creating a just society, same time as today. Thank you for joining us as part of this series. Thanks to the entire Fuqua team for helping organize this. And I look forward to seeing you all in the real world down the road. See you soon. Bye now.